Hey guys, tonight we begin with a house that looks, from a distance, too peaceful to be real. There is snow on the roof. Not the polite little dusting people put on Christmas cards, but the heavy snow that pushes down on thatch, seals paths, buries the yard, and turns the village into a low white animal curled against the dark. Somewhere inside, a fire is burning. A pot hangs over it. Maybe a cow shifts at the far end of the building. Maybe a child wakes under a wool cover and hears the wind worrying at the roof like it has legal rights to come in. And if you are modern, warm and lucky, it is easy to look at this scene and think, cosy. That is the first little trap. Because medieval coziness was not really a style, it was a negotiation with winter, and winter was a very serious negotiator. The house did not defeat the cold. It delayed it, confused it, trapped a little heat where people could reach it, and made everyone pay for that heat in smoke, labour, cramped sleep, damp clothing, and the daily management of fire. So tonight we are going into the medieval winter home, not the fancy cottage, but the living machine. The thatch that kept rain and snow out until it did not, the wattle-and-daub walls that held the wind back with woven sticks and clay, the central hearth that gave light and warmth while filling the room with smoke, the beds and animal stalls that turned space itself into insulation. We are mostly in northern and western Europe between the 12th and 15th centuries, because there was no single medieval home. An English cottage, a Dartmoor longhouse, and a Scandinavian farmstead could share problems without sharing the same solution. And before we step in, if you enjoy these slow little journeys into the strange practical intelligence of the past, you can give the video a like, subscribe if you want more calm history for the end of the day, and tell us in the comments where you are watching from and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The first thing to notice is that the door is smaller than you want it to be. You bend a little as you enter, which is already the house teaching your body the rules. Modern comfort likes wide doors, bright entries, and the confident feeling that a building exists to welcome you. A medieval winter house was less generous. A low doorway helped keep out drafts. A smaller opening meant less heat rushing away every time someone came in with snow on their shoes, mud on their hem, or a bundle of sticks under one arm. It also meant you might smack your head if you forgot humility, which, in medieval architecture, was sometimes delivered very efficiently. Inside, the light is not waiting for you. It has to be made. If the day is already fading, the room gathers darkness in the corners. Windows, if present, may be small, shuttered, covered with oiled cloth, horn, or simple openings rather than the clear glass panes we imagine from later houses and churches. The walls themselves are not the smooth, charming surfaces of a renovated heritage inn. In many places, they are made from the materials the landscape allowed: timber frames, woven hazel or willow, clay daub mixed with straw, stone where stone was plentiful, turf in regions where earth itself became architecture, and thatch made from straw, reeds, heather, or other local plants. These materials were not decorative. They were decisions shaped by cost, climate, skill, and access. At the centre, or sometimes set according to local plan and period, is the hearth. Not always a neat fireplace with a chimney. In many earlier and humbler buildings, the fire burns on an open hearth, often on a prepared patch of clay, stone, or beaten earth. Archaeologists can sometimes find these hearths as burnt patches, fire-cracked stones, ash, and soot stains. Roof timbers in surviving medieval buildings can also preserve the memory of smoke from open fires. The smoke rises because that is what smoke would like to do, but it does not always leave in a hurry. It drifts upward into rafters, curls under the roof, blackens beams, and searches for a smoke hole, louver, gap, or thatch porous enough to let it escape. So the hearth is both the heart and the problem. It cooks the stew, it warms the fingers, it dries damp cloth, badly but better than nothing. It gives enough light to mend, carve, spin, whisper, scold, pray, and stare silently into the coals after a day that has used every joint in your body. But it also fills the room with smoke, soot, danger, and a smell that does not politely remain near the fire. Smoke gets into hair, smoke gets into wool, smoke gets into the beams above your head, until the house itself seems to have been cured like meat. If you are standing in that room on a deep winter evening, you understand quickly that warmth is not evenly distributed. Heat gathers close to the fire, then fades into the edges. The person nearest the hearth has a different winter from the person near the door. The baby wrapped close to an adult body has a different winter from the older child near a colder wall. A wealthier household, with better built walls, more fuel, separate chambers, hangings, and perhaps a proper fireplace has a different winter from the family counting sticks as carefully as coins. The fire reveals hierarchy without saying a word. Even the floor participates. A medieval floor might be beaten earth, sometimes strewn with rushes or straw, sometimes damp, sometimes compacted by generations of feet, boots, dogs, chickens, and spilled life. In cold weather, the floor is not neutral. It is a slow thief. Straw helps, wooden boards help where available, raised beds help, shoes help until they are wet. But winter is patient. It comes up from below as well as through the walls. This is why medieval warmth often meant crowding. Crowding was physics. Bodies produce heat. Animals produce heat. Curtains around beds trap heat. Low spaces trap heat. Shared sleeping keeps heat from wandering away into the dark where it benefits no one except possibly the mice. In some regions, especially in longhouse or byre-house arrangements, humans and livestock lived under the same roof, sometimes with cattle at one end and people at the other. This was not universal, and it varied by region and period, but where it existed, it made practical sense. Cattle were wealth on legs. You did not leave wealth outside to freeze, sicken, or be stolen if you had a better option. Bringing animals indoors helped protect them, and their bodies added warmth, smell, moisture, sound, and a firm reminder that medieval domestic life did not have our clean boundary between household and barn. The modern nose may object. The medieval accountant may reply, yes, but the cow survived. And that really is the doorway into the whole subject. The medieval winter home was not built around comfort first. It was built around keeping enough people, animals, tools, food, and fire alive until spring. Coziness, when it appeared, was the byproduct of survival arranged well. A wall that held, a roof that shed snow, a fire that did not go out, a bed curtain that trapped a pocket of warmth, a pot of something hot enough to make the room feel briefly kinder than the weather. Outside, the cold had the fields. Inside, people tried to give it as little room as possible. What follows is not a picture of medieval people being quaint. It is a picture of people doing mathematics with their body. A house in winter had to answer a set of questions that never stopped asking themselves. How much wind can the walls slow down? How much heat can the roof hold under the thatch? How close can a family sleep without turning rest into a quarrel? How much smoke can a room tolerate before warmth becomes its own punishment? And, perhaps most important of all, how much fuel can be gathered before the dark months begin closing their hand? Fuel was the quiet tyrant behind the whole arrangement. A fire looks simple when it is already burning. In the modern imagination, logs appear beside the hearth as if summoned by good taste. In an actual medieval village, wood was labour, law, access, weather, and argument. Someone had to cut it, gather it, carry it, store it, keep it dry enough to burn, and protect it from being used too quickly. Rights to collect wood could be shaped by custom, lordship, common rights, forest law, and local pressure. In some places, fallen branches mattered. Coppiced wood mattered. Peat mattered where peat was available. Dung, brush, reeds, and scraps might matter too, depending on landscape and poverty. A household did not simply decide to be warm. It had to afford warmth in time, muscle, permission, and luck. This is where the shape of the house begins to make sense. Thick walls were not just picturesque. Low ceilings were not just primitive. Small windows were not just sad. These were ways of conserving the tiny empire of heat that a hearth could create. Every crack was a negotiation failure. Every gap around a door was winter finding a lawyer. If the house was timber framed, the frame carried the burden, while panels between the timbers could be filled with wattle and daub, woven sticks packed and plastered with clay, straw, dung, lime, or whatever local mixture worked. It was not glamorous, but glamour is a poor insulator. The value of the wall was in its stubbornness. It did not have to be perfect. It had to be good enough, repairable enough, and made from things ordinary people could reach. That last part matters. Medieval building was deeply local. A person living in a stone-rich upland area might see stone as normal. A person in a wooded region might see timber as the obvious skeleton of a home. A person in a treeless, windy northern place might turn to turf, earth, driftwood, or imported timber when available. There is no honest way to describe the medieval house without saying, again and again, that geography had a vote. A roof had an even heavier vote. Thatch was one of the great practical arts of the pre-modern world. Straw, reed, heather, sedge, or other plant materials could be layered into a roof thick enough to shed rain and trap air. That trapped air was part of the magic. A good thatch roof was not just a hat for the house. It was a breathing, insulating mass. It could keep weather out, hold warmth in, and give the building that soft, rounded shape that modern people now find charming, because we do not have to climb up there in miserable weather and repair it before the next storm. The roof was shelter, but it was also risk. Dry thatch and open flame are not natural friends. A stray spark, a poorly managed hearth, or careless lighting could turn a home into a disaster. Towns, with houses packed close together, had special reason to fear fire. A village house burning was terrible enough. A town fire could become a public argument between flame, timber, thatch, panic, and wind, with wind usually behaving like an accomplice. So medieval warmth depended on restraint. The fire had to be fed, but not wildly. The roof had to breathe, but not leak. The smoke had to escape, but not all the heat with it. A home was a controlled contradiction. Keep the air moving enough to survive, keep it still enough to stay warm. This contradiction lived in the lungs. When we imagine a cosy hearth, we often imagine clean flame. Medieval fire was rarely so polite. Wood quality varied, fuel could be damp, peat smoked in its own way. Open hearth sent smoke upward, but upward did not always mean outward. In a hall without a chimney, smoke might hang in the upper air, leaving a clearer breathing layer lower down if the room behaved itself. But rooms do not always behave. Wind shifts, roof vents fail, doors open, children move, pots are stirred. Someone adds fuel at the wrong moment, a gust pushes smoke sideways, and suddenly the warm room is also an eye-watering room. This is one reason the medieval interior could be dark above and alive below. The rafters blackened. The upper space became a smoky reservoir. The lower space, where people sat, worked, crouched and slept, was where life tried to remain possible. Smoke was not merely a nuisance. It preserved roof timbers in some cases, discouraged certain pests, flavoured the entire atmosphere of domestic life, and made everyone accept that warmth came with a taste. There was no clean separation between technology and discomfort. The hearth also organised time. In winter, the fire was a clock without numbers. Morning began with coaxing embers back to life, or rebuilding flame from saved coals. A dead fire was not just inconvenient, it was a small domestic defeat. Someone had to fetch new fire, strike sparks, or spend precious material getting it going again. During the day, the hearth governed cooking, drying, light and labour. At night, banking the fire was an act of hope. The household slept, knowing that warmth had to be preserved through darkness, not reinvented from nothing. Around that fire, winter work continued. The medieval home was not only a place of rest, it was a workshop, kitchen, nursery, storehouse, barn-adjacent shelter, social room, and sometimes sleeping hall all at once. In winter, outdoor labour shrank or changed, but indoor tasks multiplied. Wool could be spun, tools repaired, nets mended, leather worked, grain sorted, cloth patched, children watched, food prepared, animals checked. The darkness shortened the day. But poverty had always been talented at finding work that could be done in poor light. Imagine the sound, not silence. A winter room might hold the crackle of fire, the dull knock of wood, the scrape of a pot, a spindle turning, someone coughing, a child shifting under covers, an animal breathing nearby, rain or snow hissing against thatch, and the wind testing every weakness in the walls. The house is not quiet in the modern sense. It is quiet in the older sense. Nothing catastrophic is happening yet. That was its own kind of peace. And in that peace, the house taught everyone where they belonged. The oldest might sit closer to warmth. The sick might be given a better place if the household could spare one. Important guests, when present, might receive the honour of proximity. Children learned that fire was comfort and danger together. Dogs understood the hearth with the confidence of creatures who have never needed a lecture on thermodynamics. Cats, where present, made the same discovery and probably claimed credit for it. But even in humour, the rule remains: heat had rank. A home could soften winter, but it rarely abolished inequality. The better-built house, the larger fuel supply, the drier bedding, the extra cloak, the loft above animals, the wall hanging blocking a draught, the servant awake before dawn to stir the coals. These things divided one winter from another. A lord and a labourer might live under the same sky, but they did not live in the same cold. The strange thing is that the poorer house may be the one we now find more visually comforting. Low roof, straw bed, firelight, earthen wall, a pot of soup, snow outside. It looks like warmth simplified. But that image hides the work that keeps it from becoming misery. The soup required stored food, the fire required fuel, the straw required changing, the roof required maintenance, the wall required repair, the family required cooperation. The whole house was not a postcard. It was a fragile agreement, renewed every morning, between need and material. And by the time the room grows darker, the real genius of the place becomes visible. Not that it was warm, but that it made a little warmth matter. The real winter house began where the wall failed. Medieval builders were not foolish. They understood drafts the way sailors understand leaks. A cold line of air at ankle height, a wet patch near the threshold, a smoky backdraft rolling under the roof. These were not abstract design flaws. They were daily messages from the building. The house spoke through discomfort, and people answered with repairs. A gap might be stuffed, a shutter might be tightened, a loose section of daub might be patched with fresh clay, a roof might be mended with new bundles of thatch before weather found the weakness. In a world without modern insulation, weatherproofing was not a one-time achievement, it was a relationship. The house had to be watched almost like an animal. It sagged, dried, cracked, softened, smoked, leaked, and complained. Then someone fixed it as best they could. This is why medieval winter began before winter. The comfortable room in January was made by work done in September and October, sometimes earlier. Wood had to be cut or gathered before the worst mud and snow. Thatch had to be repaired before rain became ice. Food had to be preserved before fresh growth disappeared. Bedding had to be aired, if possible, before damp settled in like an unwanted relative with no plan to leave. Tools had to be ready. Animals had to be housed. The household had to think in advance because winter punished surprise. And winter, being winter, was fond of surprise. A roof that held through one storm might reveal its weak spot in the next. A fuel pile that seemed generous in autumn might shrink with frightening speed when cold deepened. A sickness in the household could change everything. Because winter systems depended on labour, someone had to fetch water, someone had to tend animals, someone had to keep the fire alive, someone had to cook, mend, carry, sweep, cut, patch, watch, and wake. When one body failed, the whole architecture of survival felt it. This is the part modern coziness usually edits out. Warmth was social. A medieval home did not stay warm because a person pressed a button. It stayed warm because people obeyed a rhythm together. The fire was not fed only by wood, it was fed by routine. Someone rose before others. Someone knew where the driest fuel was kept. Someone understood which sticks caught quickly and which burned slowly. Someone watched sparks. Someone scolded a child away from flame. Someone shifted a pot. Someone pulled a wet cloak farther from the smoke. Someone checked whether the door had been properly closed. In poorer households, this shared rhythm may have been especially tight because there was less room for error. Fuel wasted in the morning was cold in the night. Damp bedding ignored in the day was misery after sunset. A broken shutter could turn sleep into endurance. A small failure could travel through the whole household, touching food, rest, health, temper, and work. So the medieval winter house was not just a structure, it was a discipline. You can see that discipline most clearly around the threshold. The doorway was a weak point, almost a little border crossing between two governments. Outside, winter ruled by wind, snow, rain, mud, and darkness. Inside, the household tried to enforce a smaller law. Shut the door quickly, scrape off the worst mud, keep the animals where they belong, do not stand chatting with the latch open unless you want everyone to hate you quietly. Every entry cost heat. Every exit let winter look around. The threshold also carried dirt and status. A person coming in from the yard brought the world on their shoes. If the house had an earthen floor, dirt did not enter a pristine space, so much as join relatives already living there. But wet mud was still a problem. So was snow. So was dung. The medieval home could be practical about filth without being careless about it. People managed mess constantly, because mess had consequences. Damp straw smelled. Wet floors chilled feet. Rot weakened materials. Vermin liked opportunity. A house did not need modern cleanliness to have its own standards of order. Those standards were tied to warmth in ways we sometimes miss. Dry was warm. Raised was warm. Covered was warm. Enclosed was warm. A chest keeping textiles off the floor was not only storage, it was protection from damp. A hanging or cloth near a bed was not only decoration, it was a soft wall. A bench near the hearth was not merely furniture, it was a claim to heat. A loft, where one existed, could capture warmth rising from below, though smoke and air quality complicated that comfort. Even clutter, if arranged well, could blunt drafts and hold pockets of still air. Still air was precious, moving air stole. That is why curtains, screens, partitions, and bed enclosures mattered so much when people had access to them. The goal was not to heat a whole house evenly. That idea belongs to later worlds with different fuel systems, different architecture, and a more arrogant relationship with winter. Medieval households often created smaller zones of survivable warmth inside larger zones of cold. The bed, the hearthside, the sheltered corner, the curtained space, the spot away from the door. These were microclimates. A bed could be a room inside a room. For wealthier people, beds might have curtains, mattresses, bolsters, sheets, blankets, coverlets, and enough textile wealth to make sleep feel protected. For poorer people, bedding could be simpler: straw, wool, skins, coarse cloth, whatever the household could obtain and maintain. Shared beds were common in many pre-modern settings, not only because people lacked space, but because warmth itself encouraged closeness. Privacy was not the central luxury. Survival often got there first and sat down heavily. The body learnt this lesson before pride did. A person could be modest, irritable, weary, offended by another person's elbow, and still understand that a solitary cold bed was worse. The same was true of clothing indoors. Modern people often imagine houses as places where outdoor layers come off and the body relaxes into softness. In a medieval winter, indoor clothing remained part of the heating system. Wool tunics, hoods, caps, stockings, cloaks, and layered garments did the work that central heating now does invisibly. The house warmed the clothing warmed the body warmed the bed warmed the night. Nothing worked alone. Wool deserves its own small moment of respect here. It was not perfect. It could be heavy, scratchy, smoky, damp and smoky. But wool insulates even when somewhat damp, and in a cold, wet climate, that matters more than elegance. Linen had its place, leather had its place, fur or sheepskin had its place when available, but wool was one of the great quiet technologies of survival. A good wool layer was not fashion first. It was a portable wall. And the house itself, in many ways, behaved like clothing. It wrapped, layered, trapped air, absorbed moisture, needed repair, and smelled strongly of use. Everyone had to wear it together. This is why the idea of a cosy medieval home becomes more interesting once the fantasy breaks. The coziness was not false. There really could be comfort, firelight on a dark evening, hot food, familiar voices, animals breathing nearby, the small happiness of dry socks when fortune smiled. But the comfort was never separate from management. Every pleasant thing had a job. Every soft thing had a cost. Every warm pocket in the house had been made by someone's labour, someone's knowledge, or someone's place in the household order. Winter did not care whether the room looked charming. It only cared where the heat escaped. By the time winter had truly settled, the house no longer felt like a shelter from the season. It felt like a small country surrounded by enemies. The enemies were not dramatic. They did not arrive with banners. They arrived as wet cuffs, stiff fingers, sour smoke, a door that would not quite close, a roof edge dripping where it should not drip, and the particular misery of waking before dawn because some part of your body had escaped the bedding. A foot outside the cover could become a whole political crisis. The household might have no written constitution, but everyone understood that blankets were territory. Morning began carefully. Someone had to bring the fire back. If embers had survived under ash, the day started with a small mercy. A person could kneel near the hearth, coax the dull red heart of yesterday into flame, feed it with tinder, then small sticks, then better fuel once it had remembered its purpose. If the fire had died completely, the day began colder and more irritating, which is a dangerous combination in any century. Fire-making was possible, of course, but it cost time and effort at the exact hour when the room was least forgiving. The first warmth was not generous. It touched the hands before the feet. It warmed the face while the back remained suspicious. People turned themselves like bread before flame. Children learned the old domestic dance of getting close enough to feel relief, but not so close that clothing, hair, or bedding became a new and much louder problem. A winter household smelled different in the morning. Ash, damp wool, bodies, straw, smoke settled into wood, last night's stew, animal breath if the house included livestock nearby, and the cold mineral smell of earth floor or stone, all layered together. Modern life spends a great deal of money pretending indoor air has no history. Medieval air remembered everything. Then came water. Water sounds simple until you have to fetch it in winter. A household needed it for cooking, drinking, brewing, animals, washing where washing was possible, and the ordinary maintenance of life. A well, stream, or nearby source could become more difficult in freezing weather. Ice had to be broken, paths had to be walked, containers had to be carried back by hand. The water itself brought cold into the house. It was useful, necessary, and rude. Cooking turned that cold necessity into something kinder. A pot near the hearth was one of the great centres of winter survival. Pottage, broth, grains, peas, beans, onions, leeks, herbs, scraps of meat when available, salted or smoked foods, cheese, bread, ale. The exact diet depended heavily on region, class, season, and luck. But the principle was steady. Warm food did more than fill the stomach. It carried heat inward. This is where the medieval hearth becomes more than architecture. It becomes the household's stomach. The pot did not merely cook, it organised the day. It turned stored harvest into meals. It softened hard grains and dried peas. It made tougher foods edible. It warmed water. It allowed leftovers to stretch. It transformed the cold facts of winter storage into something that could be swallowed slowly while the wind performed its complaints outside. And winter food had to be planned long before it was eaten. Medieval households lived with the seasonal memory of fields. The bread in January remembered the harvest months. The salted meat remembered slaughter time. The ale remembered brewing. The cheese remembered milk from a warmer season. The The dried herbs remembered a garden that no longer existed except in bundles. A winter meal was not just dinner, it was proof that earlier labour had not failed. Of course, it could fail. A poor harvest, a sick animal, spoiled grain, a badly stored food supply, excessive rents or dues, theft, war, disease, or simple bad weather could turn winter from hard to dangerous. The home could keep out wind, but it could not invent food from nothing. A fire could warm a pot, but it could not fill it. This is one of the colder truths hidden under the glow of medieval domestic scenes. The house made survival possible, but it did not guarantee it. Still, when things held together, winter created a kind of dense indoor life. Tasks gathered around light and heat. A woman might spin near the hearth, though work roles varied by household and region. Men might repair tools, carve small objects, mend harness, sort equipment, or do other indoor work when outdoor labour allowed. Children might help, bother, learn, sleep, or be assigned small, useful tasks before they could become too creative with boredom. Older people, if they had survived into age and remained within the household, might carry knowledge more valuable than muscle. How to judge damp fuel, how to patch a draft, how to read the behaviour of animals before weather turned worse. Nothing in the house was only one thing. A bench was seating, storage, work surface, sleeping place, and social marker. A chest was furniture, treasury, textile guard, and sometimes the difference between dry cloth and ruined cloth. A hook over the fire was kitchen technology. A wall hanging could be beauty, insulation, and status all at once. Even soot had its uses, though this is not an invitation to romanticize soot. Soot was very committed to becoming everyone's problem. The house also had to manage moisture, that quiet cousin of cold. Snow brought water. Rain brought water. Breath brought water. Animals brought water. Cooking brought steam. Wet clothing brought the outside indoors and then expected praise for doing so. If dampness lingered, it entered straw, bedding, walls, wood, and mood. A cold, dry day could be harsh. A cold, wet day could feel personal. Drying clothes near the hearth was common sense, but common sense had a smoke problem and a fire problem. A cloak hung too close might scorch. A garment too far away might remain damp for hours. The best place by the hearth was rarely empty. People, pots, animals, tools, and textiles all wanted the same warmth. The hearth was the busiest room in the house, even when it was not a room at all. At night, the house changed again. Daylight, even weak winter daylight, gave the household a little extension of the world. After dark, space contracted toward flame. Corners disappeared, work slowed or moved closer to the light. Voices softened not because medieval people were always peaceful, but because darkness has a way of making everything nearby feel more important. The fire threw moving shadows on rafters blackened by seasons of smoke. The roof above became less an object than a presence. It held weather away. It also held everyone's fear of sparks. Sleeping was not the clean, private retreat we often imagine. It was layered, shared, practical, and deeply shaped by resources. Beds where available were valuable. Bedding was valuable. Warmth was valuable. People might sleep close, sometimes several to a bed, with clothes still on or near at hand. Curtains, screens, or enclosed beds could create little pockets of heat and modesty, especially in better-off households. In humbler rooms, sleep was more exposed to sound, smell, and interruption. But if the fire held, if the roof did not leak, if the animals were settled, if the food had lasted another day, if the wind found no new opening, then the house had done something remarkable. It had not made winter gentle. It had made winter survivable until morning. The difference between one winter and another could be measured in inches. A few inches closer to the hearth, a few inches farther from the door, a few inches of extra thatch above the rafters, a few inches of wool folded over a sleeping body, a few inches of wall between the human end of a longhouse and the breath of animals in the byre. Medieval class was often described in land, rent, rank, law, and duty, but in winter it became physical. It became distance from cold. A lord's hall was not paradise. Large spaces could be draughty, smoky, hard to heat, and wildly expensive to maintain. Stone, which looks powerful, is perfectly capable of being cold with great dignity. But wealth changed the terms of the argument. A better household could command more fuel, more servants, more textiles, more repairs, more storage, more specialized rooms, and more ways to make cold someone else's immediate problem. That last part matters. In an elite household, warmth involved labor that might be almost invisible to the people enjoying it. Someone rose to tend fires, someone hauled wood, someone cleaned ash, someone carried water, someone shook out bedding, beat dust from hangings, closed shutters, opened shutters, moved braziers, watched sparks, warmed cloths, prepared food, and kept the entire machine of comfort from embarrassing its owner. A great house did not simply possess warmth. It employed people to chase cold from one room to another. And still, cold came back. But in a peasant household, the distance between maintenance and survival was much shorter. If the family needed fuel, family labor often had to get it. If the wall cracked, the repair was not a line item for a steward to arrange at leisure. It was mud, hands, time, and urgency. If bedding grew damp, the people who slept in it also had to solve it. Poor households did not lack intelligence, they lacked margin. Margin is one of the quiet luxuries of history. A wealthy person could waste some heat, a poor person usually could not. A wealthy person might have a chamber away from the central noise of work, animals, cooking, and smoke. A poor person often lived where all those things overlapped. A wealthy household could own enough textile wealth to make walls softer, beds warmer, and privacy more believable. A poor household might have to treat every decent blanket like a small inheritance. Textiles were warmth made visible. We tend to think of architecture as wood, stone, clay, and roof. But in medieval winter, cloth was architecture too. Wall hangings reduced drafts and made rooms less brutally cold. Bed curtains created sleeping enclosures. Wool blankets, coverlets, cloaks, hoods, and layered garments formed movable rooms around the body. Even a seat cushion, where available, could change the meaning of a bench in January. This is why inventories from wealthier households can feel like maps of comfort. They list beds, sheets, coverlets, hangings, cushions, table linens, clothing, and stored fabrics. Behind each item is not just status but temperature. A tapestry was not merely art, it was a warmer wall with a better personality. A curtained bed was not merely display, it was a small climate system for people who could afford to sleep inside a box of cloth. For poorer people, warmth was often more communal and less polite. Shared sleeping was efficient, shared space was efficient. A room that held cooking, working, eating, and sleeping could be unpleasant, but it wasted less heat than a grand arrangement of cold rooms. Poverty, which is rarely invited into design magazines, can be a ruthless architect. Gender also shaped the winter house, not because women and men felt cold differently in some poetic sense, but because work and responsibility were divided unevenly. Across much of medieval Europe, household management, cooking, textile work, childcare, tending small animals, brewing, dairying, and other domestic labour often fell heavily on women, though patterns varied by region, class, marital status, and local economy. Winter intensified this labour. A fire that warmed the room also demanded tending. A pot that fed the family demanded preparation. A garment that insulated a body demanded spinning, weaving, mending, washing, drying, and preserving. The home was not a place where labour ended, it was where much of it concentrated. A woman near the hearth might be closer to warmth, but that did not make the place restful. The warmest zone was often the working zone. The cook was not luxuriating beside the fire like a painting of domestic peace. She was managing flame, smoke, heat, food, children, time, and the general medieval talent for making one pair of hands answer 12 problems at once. If someone today says, At least she got to stay indoors. The correct historical response is a long stare into the middle distance. Indoors was not idle. Indoors was production with worse ventilation. Children experienced the winter house as both protection and training. They learned where not to stand, what not to touch, when to be quiet, how to help, how to tolerate crowding, and how to read adult moods when supplies were tight. The fire was magical until it burned you. The animals were familiar until one kicked. The dark was ordinary until a storm made the roof sound uncertain. Childhood in a medieval winter home was not one thing. It could include tenderness, play, fear, chores, hunger, warmth, irritation, and the heavy sleep of bodies that had spent the day being useful before they had much choice. Old age, too, changed the geography of warmth. An elderly person could be a treasured holder of skill, memory, and household authority, or they could be vulnerable in a world where survival depended on productive labour. In a cold room, weak circulation, illness, stiffness, and exhaustion were not minor inconveniences. They were spatial problems. Where does the old body sit? Who gives up the warmest place? Who shares bedding? Who wakes when coughing begins? A household's moral life could be measured, quietly, by how it arranged its heat. Law and custom hovered around the house even when no official stood in the doorway. Access to woods, pasture, peat, building materials, grazing, and common land shaped winter survival. If a village had rights to collect certain kinds of wood, those rights mattered when frost came. If a lord restricted access, if forest law limited what could be taken, if common rights were disputed, then cold became legal. The forest was not just scenery, it was a fuel store with rules attached. A fallen branch might be warmth, but it might also be someone else's property. There is a dark little comedy in that, though it is not funny to the freezing person. Human beings manage to create paperwork between themselves and heat. Winter may be natural, but access to winter survival was often political. Even building materials could carry hierarchy. A family needed permission, money, labour, or customary right to obtain timber, repair walls, cut thatching material, or maintain structures. The roof above your head was connected to the fields around you, the lord above you, the animals beside you, the tools in your hand, and the obligations waiting after harvest. No house stood alone, even when it looked lonely under snow. That is the hidden system inside the cosy image. A glowing cottage window does not only tell us someone is warm, it tells us that fuel was gathered, rights were negotiated, labour was spent, animals were protected, women's work continued, children adapted, old people endured, and walls made of local materials held for one more night. The window glows because a whole society is burning carefully behind it. By late winter, the house had become a kind of memory device. It remembered every decision made months before. The repaired roof remembered the person who climbed up before the hard rains. The woodpile remembered the hands that gathered it when the air still smelled of leaves instead of ice. The salted meat, if there was any left, remembered slaughter time. The straw in the bedding remembered a field now hidden under frost. The thickest blanket remembered sheep, shears, spinning, weaving, mending, and the long patience of textile work. Nothing warm appeared suddenly. Winter revealed the past by making people live inside its consequences. That is why the hidden rule of medieval winter housing was not simply build thick walls or keep a good fire. The deeper rule was this: survival depended on storing summer inside the house. A thatched roof was stored sunlight. Grass, reeds, straw, or heather had grown in warmer months, being cut, dried, bundled, carried, and laid into layers. Firewood was stored forest. Grain was stored field. Wool was stored pasture. Cheese was stored milk. Ale was stored grain and labour. Even a clay wall, mixed with straw and packed around woven sticks, was a landscape transformed into a barrier against weather. The house was not separate from nature. It was nature rearranged into a temporary refusal. And the refusal had to be maintained. A medieval winter home could look still from the outside, with snow pressed against the walls and smoke leaking through the roof, but inside it was always in motion. Ash had to be cleared. Fresh fuel had to be brought in. Damp straw had to be replaced when possible. Pots had to be cleaned. Animals had to be fed. The floor had to be managed. Doors had to be shut. Tools had to be kept somewhere dry enough that iron did not suffer more than necessary. Food had to be checked for spoilage, pests, mould, theft, and the very medieval problem of someone being hungrier than the plan allowed. The plan mattered because winter shortened choices. In warmer months, a household might stretch itself outward, work in fields, gather plants, move animals, repair fences, travel to market, visit neighbours with less calculation. In winter, the centre of gravity pulled inward. The home became more crowded, but also more important. It was not merely where people returned after work. It was where work, rest, food, animals, storage, illness, faith, family tension, and survival collided under one roof. That collision produced habits that can look strange from a distance. For example, modern people often imagine separate rooms as an obvious improvement, and in many ways they are. Privacy is lovely. So is not sleeping beside someone who snores like a cart axe or filing a complaint. But separate rooms are expensive to heat. The more air you divide and claim, the more cold air you have to manage. For much of medieval domestic life, especially among ordinary people, openness was not just poverty, it was efficiency. A single heated room, or a central heated space with functions gathered around it, made practical sense when every stick mattered. Space itself had to be rationed. The home's interior arrangement often followed heat rather than preference. The working place was near light. The resting place was where warmth could linger. The storage place had to be safe from damp, vermin, animals, and careless feet. The animals, if under the same roof in a byre or longhouse arrangement, had their own practical zone. The door, that traitorous hole in the wall, could not be allowed to dominate the room more than necessary. The fire formed the centre, but the centre was not always comfortable. Smoke-shaped posture. People sat, bent, turned and worked in the breathable layer when smoke gathered above. This is one reason the image of an open medieval hall with a glowing central hearth can be misleading if imagined as clean, golden comfort. It could be grand. It could also be hazy, acrid, and blackened above. The warmth near the flames came with eyes that watered, throats that tightened, and rafters that slowly darkened into a record of every meal, every winter, every careful attempt not to freeze. Chimneys changed this story, but not all at once. In castles, monasteries, manor houses, and wealthier urban homes, fireplaces and chimneys became more common earlier and offered more controlled heat and smoke removal. In humbler rural buildings, open hearths and smoke escaping through roof openings or vents persisted in many places for a long time. This was not because poorer people had failed to discover the concept of smoke bad. It was because architecture costs money, materials, labour, and sometimes permission. A chimney is not only an idea, it is masonry, maintenance, and social difference stacked upward. A chimney made smoke behave more politely. It did not make winter disappear. Even with fireplaces, heat could be localised. A room might be warm near the hearth and cold only a few steps away. Large elite halls could still be difficult to heat, which is one reason smaller chambers mattered. The wealthy did not simply build bigger and become warmer. They built more ways to choose where warmth concentrated. They could withdraw into smaller rooms, hang cloth, close shutters, burn more fuel, and place bodies in better relation to flame. The poor also concentrated warmth, but with fewer choices. This is why the medieval house often feels less like a container and more like a set of tactics. The wall slows, the roof insulates, the hearth concentrates, the bed encloses, the cloak travels, the animal warms, the storage chest protects, the shutter blocks, the family gathers. Each piece does one job imperfectly. Together, on a good night, they do enough. Enough was the real goal. Modern comfort often promises abundance, steady temperature, hot water on demand, dry floors, separate rooms, clean air, soft lighting, quiet appliances, insulation hidden inside walls, and a thermostat that lets us negotiate with winter using one finger. Medieval comfort was more modest and more physical. It asked whether your toes stopped aching, whether your bedding was dry, whether the pot steamed, whether the roof held, whether the fire would still be alive at dawn, whether the cow was breathing, whether the baby slept. The scale of comfort was smaller, but the relief could be enormous. Think of coming inside after carrying wood through wet snow. Your hands are stiff, your shoulders ache, your shoes are cold. The room is smoky, yes, and dark, and crowded, and someone is probably in the exact place you wanted to stand. But the fire exists. The wall cuts the wind. The pot smells of food. A body can turn toward heat and feel the skin begin, slowly, to return to itself. That moment is not fantasy. It is real. It is also not simple. It contains exhaustion, gratitude, irritation, and calculation. How much fuel remains? Is the roof dripping? Is the child coughing from cold or smoke? Did the stored grain stay dry? Can tomorrow's weather allow anyone to fetch more wood? Is the animal ill? Will the Lord's demand, the rent, the tithe, the debt, or the market price leave enough for the household to last? The medieval winter home was cosy in the way a ship in a storm is cosy, precious because the alternative is outside. And once you see it that way, every beam and blanket changes meaning. The house is no longer a quaint object under snow. It is a working system under pressure, holding together because people understood that warmth was never a single thing. It was a chain, and winter only needed one weak link. The weak link was often not the wall, but the season's length. A sharp cold night could be endured. A week of bitter weather could be managed with discipline, grumbling, and a sensible rearrangement of bodies around the fire. But a long winter had a different personality. It did not attack all at once. It subtracted. A little less fuel, a little less food, a little less patience, a little less dryness in the bedding, a little more smoke in the chest, a little more fear in the way adults counted what remained. Late winter was where the beautiful idea of the cosy home became most honest. By then, the house might have done its work for months. It had kept rain out more often than not. It had preserved food, sheltered animals, held tools, contained children, and gathered the family into a survivable knot. But every system under pressure begins to show its seams. Thatch thinned or loosened, stored wood shrank, straw grew stale, walls absorbed damp, tempers shortened. The fire that felt comforting in early winter could begin to feel like a demanding little lord sitting in the middle of the room, accepting tribute in sticks and giving back just enough warmth to keep everyone loyal. The household had to decide how to spend its remaining heat. That sounds odd, because heat is not a coin you can place on a table. But in practice, it was spent constantly. A longer cooking fire used fuel. Drying soaked clothing used heat. Keeping a sick person warm used bedding and attention. Protecting newborn animals used space and labour. Opening the door to do necessary work cost warmth. Letting the fire burn higher for comfort at night might mean colder fingers tomorrow. Everything had a price, even relief. A good winter house, then, was also a house of restraint. People knew how to live with partial comfort. This may be one of the hardest things for modern listeners to feel properly, because we often experience discomfort as a failure of the system. If the room is cold, something is wrong. If air is smoky, something has malfunctioned. If the bed is damp, the building has betrayed us. In a medieval household, discomfort did not always mean failure. Sometimes it meant the system was working as well as it could within the limits of money, materials, weather, and luck. The difference between hardship and disaster could be narrow. A smoky room was bad. A room with no fire was worse. Crowded sleep was annoying. Solitary cold could be dangerous. Animals indoors smelled strongly and complicated cleanliness. Dead or sick animals could threaten the household's food, labour, rent payments, and future. Damp wool was miserable. No wool was worse. A leaky roof was a problem. Losing the roof was a calamity. Medieval survival involved ranking discomforts and choosing the least ruinous one. The house became a place where bad options were sorted. This sorting was especially clear when illness entered. Cold weather could strain everyone, but the very young, the old, the sick, and the underfed were more vulnerable. We should be careful with modern medical certainty when looking backward. Medieval records do not always tell us what we want to know, and causes of illness were understood very differently. But we do not need perfect diagnosis to see the pressure. A coughing child in a smoky, cold, damp room was not an abstract tragedy. It was a household problem with no easy solution. Move the child closer to the fire, and smoke worsens. Move them away, and cold worsens. Use more fuel, and tomorrow's supply shrinks. Give better bedding, and someone else sleeps colder. Warmth made moral questions physical. The same could be true with food. A hot meal had to be divided. A thick pottage could be stretched with more water. Bread could be rationed. Cheese could be saved or eaten. Meat, if any remained, could mark a special day, a needed strength, or a moment when restraint finally gave up and admitted everyone was tired. Hunger changed the atmosphere of a house faster than cold alone. Cold makes people quiet. Hunger makes quiet sharp. And yet, not every winter scene was grim. This is important. Ordinary people did not spend the whole season staring tragically at turnips while medieval violins played in the background. There could be joking, storytelling, singing, work songs, games, gossip, small celebrations, feast days, parish rhythms. A child laughing at exactly the wrong time and making the adults laugh too, even though they were trying to be stern. Humans are annoyingly good at producing life in conditions that should make life feel postponed. The house supported those moments because the house made gathering possible. Firelight changes faces. It hides some details and deepens others. A rough wall becomes a warm surface. A pot steaming in the room becomes more than food. It becomes evidence that the household is still functioning. A dog asleep near the hearth turns survival into a picture of undeserved confidence. Someone repairing a tool by low light becomes part of a rhythm older than memory. These moments were not fake because hardship existed. They were precious because hardship existed. Cozy, in this older sense, did not mean comfortable all the way through. It meant defended. Defended from wind by a patched wall. Defended from hunger by stored grain. Defended from freezing by a fire that everyone watched like a small, sacred animal. Defended from loneliness by the inconvenience of other people breathing nearby. Defended from darkness by flame, memory, prayer, habit, and the knowledge that others had survived winters before this one. Faith also lived in the winter house, not always loudly, but persistently. In Christian medieval Europe, the rhythm of winter included Advent, Christmas, Saints' Days, Candlemas, Lent approaching in later winter, and the parish calendar pressing its meanings into household time. Belief did not magically warm a room, but it gave people language for endurance, fear, gratitude, sin, charity, obligation, and hope. A candle could be practical light and sacred symbol at once. A blessing over a house. Animal, field, or family did not replace repair, but it sat beside repair as part of how people faced a world that could not be fully controlled. The medieval home was full of things that did two jobs. A hearth cooked and gathered, a bed warmed and marked status. A wall protected and displayed poverty or wealth. A roof sheltered and advertised local skill. A chest stored goods and preserved family memory. A candle lit a room and marked holy time. A cow provided milk, manure, labour, future calves, warmth, noise, and an astonishing commitment to making the indoor air more complicated. Again, the cow survived. That practical, unromantic fact sits close to the heart of the winter house. Survival is not always elegant. It is often smelly, repetitive, awkward, smoky, and crowded with compromises. But it is also intelligent. The people who built and lived in these homes were not waiting for modernity to explain cold to them. They knew cold intimately. They knew how it entered under doors, how it settled near floors, how it stiffened tools, how it punished laziness, how it exposed bad planning, and how it could turn a harmless draft into a nightly enemy. Their houses were answers written in clay, timber, straw, cloth, and routine. Not perfect answers, not romantic answers, but answers good enough to carry many households through the frozen dark, one guarded ember at a time. The strange relief of midwinter was that, once the hardest habits had taken over, the house became easier to understand. Not easier to live in, that would be too generous, but easier to read. By then, every person knew which corner betrayed the wind, which part of the floor stayed damp longest, which shutter needed a wedge, which child would drift toward the fire if not watched, which animal sounded wrong before it looked wrong, and which piece of wood should be saved for the hour when kindling would be most difficult. The household had learned the building's personality, and the building had learned theirs. In the blunt way buildings do, by forcing everyone to repeat what worked. This is where medieval winter survival becomes less about dramatic toughness and more about small intelligence. The cleverness was not always grand enough to appear in chronicles. No monk carefully recorded that a particular woman knew exactly how to hang a wet cloak so it dried without catching fire. No royal clerk noted that an old man could hear from bed whether the wind had shifted against the bad wall. No heroic poem praised the person who moved the bedding away from a new drip before it spoiled the straw. But these small acts were the daily engineering of survival. The house held because people noticed. History often remembers walls better than habits. Habits, unfortunately, are what kept people alive. A winter home depended on thousands of little corrections. A door pulled shut immediately. A pot shifted so it simmered instead of boiled away. A child rapped before sleep. A spark stamped out before it became a story told with regret. A damp board raised. A cracked patch of daub repaired before the next freeze. A ration quietly adjusted. A sick animal watched through the night because losing it would mean losing milk, labour, manure, rent security, or future hope. The household was a weather instrument with feelings. When the sky changed, people felt it in the room before anyone explained it. Wind drove smoke differently. Rain made the roof speak. Thaw loosened mud and turned paths into punishment. Frost made doors stubborn. Snow muffled the village until every indoor sound seemed more private. The home did not isolate people from weather the way a modern insulated room can. It translated weather into tasks. And every task had a temperature. Spinning wool near the hearth was not the same as spinning in a cold corner. Mending leather with numb fingers was not the same as doing it after warming your hands around a bowl. Kneading, grinding, sweeping, feeding, cleaning, carrying, washing and cutting all changed when the body was cold. We sometimes imagine medieval labour as a series of jobs, but in winter, labour was also a series of sensations. The sting of water, the ache of lifting, the relief of steam, the panic of a dropped ember. The brief bliss of sitting down before someone needed you again. The house gathered these sensations into one crowded theatre. A townhouse might do this differently from a rural cottage. Urban homes had their own winter problems. Closer neighbours, fire danger, waste, smoke, narrow streets, trade, workshops, storage, and rules about building materials or hearths that varied by town. A craftsman's house could be partly shop, partly home, with work and warmth competing for space. In some towns, upper rooms, cellars, courtyards, and street-facing commercial spaces complicated the pattern. Urban winter was not simply rural winter with more people. It was a different form of crowding, with more walls nearby and more ways for one household's fire to become everyone's emergency. Still, the same principle returned. Warmth followed systems. A baker's oven held heat differently from a peasant hearth. A smithy's fire belonged to work before comfort. A monastery might organise winter around regulated spaces, refectories, dormitories, cloisters, infirmaries, kitchens, and the discipline of communal life. A manor house could concentrate warmth through servants, screens, chambers, hangings, and access to larger fuel stores. A poor cottage had fewer layers, fewer buffers, and fewer people whose job was to make discomfort disappear before the household head noticed it. Different buildings, same enemy. And the enemy could be beautiful, which made it slightly insulting. A medieval village under snow may have been lovely in the way dangerous things sometimes are lovely from a distance. Snow-softened roofs, covered refuse, brightened moonlight, and made the world look briefly clean. But it also hid ruts, froze water sources, trapped animals, delayed travel, and turned every outdoor errand into an argument with boots. The beauty of winter was not fake, it was simply not on your side. Inside, beauty existed too, but rarely as pure decoration. Firelight on a clay wall could be beautiful. A fresh layer of clean straw could feel beautiful. The smell of hot food after cold labour could be beautiful. A wool blanket that did not smell too damp could be beautiful, in a deeply practical way. A candle flame on a holy evening could make a dark room seem, for a moment, ordered and merciful. This is important because medieval people were not merely surviving machines. They noticed comfort. They valued warmth, brightness, feasting, song, company, and the dignity of a well-kept home. Archaeology gives us post holes and hearths. Documents give us rents, rights, and inventories. But life was also made of preferences. Someone preferred a certain place near the fire. Someone liked the sound of a particular story. Someone took pride in a repaired roof. Someone arranged a chest, a cloth, a tool, or a bundle of herbs, not only because it worked, but because it made the space feel more livable. Survival did not eliminate taste, it sharpened it. A cosy home, in this older world, was not always the richest one. Wealth helped enormously, and anyone pretending otherwise should spend one wet February night with poor bedding and rethink their philosophy. But coziness also came from competence. A modest house managed well could feel safer than a larger house badly kept. A hearth tended with skill, a roof patched in time, bedding kept dry, food stretched wisely, and animals properly housed could produce a kind of trust. The people inside knew what to do next. That knowledge warmed the room almost as much as the fire. Almost. Let us not insult the fire. Still, competence changed fear. A person in a well-known house could wake in the dark and identify a sound. Roof drip, animal movement, wind at shutter, ember collapse, mouse, child, pot, door. The unknown became known. The known became manageable. And the manageable, even when uncomfortable, could become restful. This is where the medieval winter home begins to seem less primitive and more intimate. Not sentimental, intimate. Every object had been touched, repaired, moved, borrowed, argued over, slept under, smoked through, or carried in from weather. Nothing was anonymous. The house held labour the way a body holds scars. It was not clean enough for a modern fantasy. It was too alive for that. By midwinter, the household did not merely live inside the house. They lived with it. They knew its moods, fed its fire, patched its skin, shared its breath, cursed its weaknesses, trusted its strengths, and hoped, every night, that the small world under the roof would keep holding until the first real thaw changed the rules again. The deeper contradiction was that the house protected people by trapping exactly the things that made life harder. It trapped heat, yes, but it also trapped smoke. It trapped bodies, which meant warmth, but also noise, temper, sickness, smell, obligation, and the kind of intimacy that modern people usually reserve for emergencies, vacations, or apartments with very thin walls. It trapped animals when animals belonged under the same roof, which protected wealth, but also brought breath, dung, dampness, insects, and the calm, philosophical stare of a cow who had no interest in your ideas about indoor air quality. The medieval winter home was not a pure refuge. It was a compromise that worked because the outside was worse. That sounds bleak, but it helps explain something important. A modern, comfortable house often succeeds by separating things. Kitchen from bedroom, human from livestock, smoke from air, waste from living space, work from rest, public life from private life, heat from flame, water from labour, light from fire. Modern comfort is built on separation so complete that we forget separation had to be invented, paid for, piped, wired, regulated, and hidden inside walls. A medieval winter house often survived by combination. The same fire cooked, heated, lit, dried, gathered, and endangered. The same room sheltered work, meals, children, sleep, storage, repair, prayer, argument, and the occasional visiting neighbour bringing news, trouble, or both. The same animals could be food, labour, rent security, warmth, smell, and emotional attachment. The same textile could be clothing by day, bedding by night, draft blocker in emergency, and inheritance if it survived enough winters. Everything had more than one job, because few households could afford objects that did only one thing. That is why privacy was not merely absent, it was expensive. To be private, you needed extra space. To heat extra space, you needed extra fuel. To furnish it, you needed textiles and furniture. To keep it clean, you needed labour. To close it off, you needed doors, screens, walls, shutters, maybe locks. Privacy was not just a personal preference waiting for history to respect it. It was a material achievement. In winter, this mattered sharply. A separate room might be peaceful, but it might also be cold. A shared space might be irritating, but it was warmer. People did not necessarily experience this as a simple lack. They had different expectations, different standards, and different ideas of household life. But the physical truth remained. Warmth gathered people together, even when personality suggested this was unwise. The house, in other words, could force community. Not the soft modern version of community printed on a mug, but the practical kind, where everyone knows who snores, who complains, who eats too quickly, who pretends not to be cold, who gets up first, who can be trusted with embers, who hides food, who is generous with bedding, who is not. The medieval winter home made character visible because there was nowhere for character to go. This is one reason household order mattered so much. The family was not simply an emotional unit, it was an economic and survival unit. Servants, apprentices, lodgers, elderly relatives, children, spouses, kin and workers might all be part of a domestic arrangement, depending on place and class. The household was often broader than the neat modern nuclear family. It could be a labour team, moral structure, sleeping arrangement, production site, and survival contract all at once. Winter tested that contract. If food ran short, who ate first? If bedding was limited, who shared? If a servant slept near a colder area, was that normal hierarchy or quiet cruelty? If an animal needed space, what human comfort moved aside? If a young child cried from cold, who woke? If an older person became weak, who surrendered warmth? These are not always questions preserved in documents. They are the kind of questions a house asks at midnight. And the answers were shaped by power. The household head had authority, though the form and intensity varied by law, custom, religion, and local practice. Gender shaped obedience and labour, age shaped rank. Servants and apprentices lived within another household's rules. Poorer kin might depend on those with resources. In winter, authority was not an abstract legal idea. It could decide who stood near the hearth, who worked outside in cold, who slept where, who received a better cloak, who was sent to fetch water, who stayed by the sick, and who got blamed when something went wrong. A room could be full of warmth and still be unequal. This is one of the reasons the hearth is such a powerful motif. Everyone needed it, but need did not erase rank. The hearth gathered the household into one circle, while quietly reminding everyone that circles have centres and edges. Someone sat in the better place. Someone took the draught. Someone tended the pot while others ate from it. Someone kept the fire alive and remained historically invisible because records often preferred the people who owned things to the people who maintained them. The glow hides labour beautifully. It also hides danger. Fire in a medieval house was domesticated, but never tame. Sparks, embers, rushlights, candles, drying textiles, wooden structures, stored straw, thatch, and cramped interiors all belonged to the same nervous family. A sleepy mistake could matter. A child's curiosity could matter. A gust through the door could matter. A roof could preserve heat and invite catastrophe at the same time. So the house required a kind of low-level vigilance, not panic, just watchfulness. Where is the candle? Is the cloth too close? Is the ember contained? Is the door shut? Has the animal kicked loose? Has smoke shifted? Is that smell normal? A medieval winter night was not always restful simply because people lay down. The house slept lightly. There was also the problem of air. The warmth people needed came from combustion and bodies, and both changed the room. Smoke was the obvious intruder, but moisture was quieter. Every breath added a little vapour. Every pot added steam. Wet clothing exhaled cold dampness as it dried. Animals warmed and moistened the air. A packed room could be warmer and less healthy at the same time. Again, the contradiction returns. What protected you could burden you. Modern comfort tries to resolve contradictions by engineering them away. Medieval comfort often managed them through habit. Open the shutter at the right moment, not too long. Let smoke clear, but do not surrender all the heat. Dry the cloak, but do not burn it. Bring the animal in, but manage the mess. Sleep close, but endure the elbow. Eat hot food, but save enough fuel. The whole household lived inside a series of not too much and not too little. That kind of life can look simple only from very far away. Up close, it is full of judgment. Judgment about weather, judgment about materials, judgment about people, judgment about risk. The house did not make those judgments for anyone. It gave feedback, often rudely, and the household adjusted. The contradiction, then, was not a flaw in the medieval winter home. It was the condition of its success. The home had to be smoky but not choking, crowded but not impossible, closed but not airless, warm but not dangerous, dry enough, lit enough, fed enough, repaired enough, peaceful enough. Enough did not mean ideal. Enough meant everyone woke up and tried again. And perhaps that is why the image still pulls at us. We see firelight in a dark room and imagine peace, but the real power of the scene is more complicated. It is not peace exactly. It is pressure held in balance. A roof, a wall, a hearth, a bed, a cow, a pot, a family, a pile of wood, and a long night outside trying every weakness. A house could survive winter and still fail one person inside it. That is the uncomfortable truth hidden beneath all the cleverness. A patched wall, a good roof, a living fire, enough stored food, and animals safely under shelter could make a household look successful from the outside. Smoke might rise in a steady line. The door might stay closed against the wind. The thatch might hold. But inside, comfort was not distributed evenly, and neither was danger. The hidden cost of the medieval winter home was that it protected the household before it protected the individual. This was not because people were heartless. It was because the household itself was the survival unit. The family, servants, apprentices, animals, tools, stored food, bedding, fuel and building all formed one practical organism. If that organism failed, everyone suffered. So decisions often favoured the whole system, even when one person paid more of the price. A servant sent out in bad weather. A child sleeping where there was space rather than where it was warmest. A woman staying awake to tend a sick body near the fire. An older person placed close enough to heat to survive, but not always close enough to be comfortable. These were not always dramatic cruelties. Often they were the quiet arithmetic of scarcity. Scarcity is very good at disguising itself as common sense. If there is only one dry place, someone gets it. If there is only one good blanket, someone receives it and someone does not. If the fire must be kept low to save fuel, everyone is colder, but not equally colder. If food must stretch, the strongest labourer may be fed with future work in mind, while the weaker body becomes a site of worry, guilt, or neglect. We should not flatten medieval households into misery, because love existed, tenderness existed, and sacrifice existed. But love in a cold room still had to negotiate with fuel. That negotiation became sharper during emergencies. A storm that blocked travel, a roof leak over bedding, an animal falling ill, a sudden fever, a spoiled food store, a death in winter, a childbirth in cold months, or a dispute over fuel could change the whole emotional climate of the house. The walls still stood, but the interior weather changed. Fear moved faster than heat. Childbirth especially reminds us that domestic history is never just architecture. Birth usually happened within household and female community spaces, with local midwives, relatives, and neighbours depending on place and circumstance. We have to be careful here, because evidence varies and medical practice changed across regions and centuries. But the basic reality is plain enough. Cold made bodily vulnerability harder. A warm room mattered. Clean linens mattered where they could be provided. Hot water mattered. Light mattered. Space mattered. Privacy mattered. And all of these things required resources, labour, and luck. The house that felt crowded on an ordinary night could become intensely crowded around a crisis. Illness did the same. Medieval people understood sickness through frameworks different from modern medicine. Humoral theory, religious interpretation, practical observation, inherited remedies, and local experience could all shape response. Some remedies were harmless, some helpful by accident, some based on theories that made sense at the time but were wrong about the body. The winter home became the place where those beliefs met reality. A person shivered, someone warmed cloth, a pot simmered. A prayer was said, herbs might be used, advice might be offered by someone very confident, which is one of history's most reliable forms of danger. But even when the theory was mistaken, care was still care. A household trying to warm a sick child was not ignorant in the simple way modern arrogance sometimes imagines. They were working with the tools and explanations available to them. They knew cold could harm. They knew damp made things worse. They knew food, warmth, rest, and attention mattered. They might not have known why in modern terms, but bodies teach some lessons without Latin. The trouble was that care itself consumed the household. Keeping someone warm required fuel. Keeping bedding dry required labour. Keeping a fire burning through a long night required wakefulness. If smoke worsened a cough, someone had to manage ventilation without losing heat. If the sick person needed the best place, someone else moved. If illness reduced the number of working hands, chores did not kindly reduce themselves. The cow still needed tending, water still needed carrying, food still needed cooking. Winter has never been famous for pausing respectfully. This is where the cosy image becomes morally complicated. We like to imagine the medieval household gathered around the fire as a scene of unity, and sometimes it was. But unity is not always gentle. People gathered because they had to. They shared because not sharing could be fatal. They endured one another because the wall only held one group of bodies, and outside was not interested in anyone's personality. The house also intensified conflict. Cold makes small irritations larger. Hunger sharpens insult. Smoke makes tempers short. Lack of privacy turns every habit into public information. A person who wastes fuel is not merely annoying, they threaten the night. A person who leaves the door open is not merely careless, they invite the enemy inside. A person who takes too much food, too much bedding, too much space, too much authority, or too much mercy becomes part of the household weather. Domestic peace, like warmth, had to be maintained. Some households surely managed this with affection and routine, others with hierarchy, fear, scolding, obedience or silence. Most, being human, probably used an unstable mixture. The medieval home was a place of comfort, but also discipline. It taught bodies where to sit, when to speak, how much to eat, how quickly to shut a door, how to sleep beside others, how to accept discomfort without making it everyone else's problem. The walls did not create kindness. They created proximity. Kindness had to happen inside that proximity, or fail there. Even the beloved objects of the winter house could become sources of strain. The bed that warmed several bodies might also deny privacy. The animal that helped the household survive might also spread mess and stress. The fire that comforted everyone might become a site of argument over fuel, cooking time, workspace, and who had the right to be closest. The stored food that represented security might create suspicion as it dwindled. A chest could be family stability, but also a locked reminder that some things belong to one person more than another. In better-off homes, the hidden cost changed shape. There might be more fuel, more rooms, more bedding, more food, and more ways to escape the worst discomfort. But comfort moved labour onto servants. Someone else rose earlier, carried more, cleaned more, breathed smoke while working, and kept the fires prepared for people whose names were more likely to be written down. Elite comfort often appears in records as possessions: beds, hangings, silver, stores, chambers, servants. But behind each possession is motion. Hands carried the wood, hands beat the bedding, hands scrubbed soot, hands hauled water. Warmth had servants before it had switches. And yet, even servants were not just shadows in someone else's comfort. They were skilled participants in the household's survival, with knowledge of materials, routines, personalities, and risks. A careless servant could endanger a house. A competent one could keep it alive. Domestic labour was not low because it was simple. It was low because hierarchy decided whose work deserved honour. The hidden cost, then, was not only smoke or crowding, it was invisibility. The medieval winter home depended most on the people least likely to be remembered by name. Women managing hearth and food, servants carrying fuel, children learning tasks early, older people passing down household knowledge, neighbours helping in crisis, craftspeople repairing what weather damaged, and labourers whose access to warmth depended on obligations they did not design. When we look at the glowing window from outside, we see a home. If we listen longer, we hear the bargain inside it. The house will protect the group, but the group must feed the house. The fire will warm the room, but someone must breathe the smoke. The bed will gather bodies, but someone must surrender space. The roof will hold the snow, but someone must climb and mend it before it fails. That is not a failure of medieval coziness. That is what it cost. The people who paid most for warmth are often the hardest to see. A medieval winter home leaves traces in timber, ash, clay, stone, post holes, hearths, and fragments of pottery. It can leave soot on beams and impressions of woven rods in daub. It can leave foundations that tell us where a wall once stood, where a fire burned, where animals may have been stalled, where a floor was worn by feet that no one named. But the human cost of winter was softer than that. It lived in coughing, stiff hands, interrupted sleep, resentment swallowed in the dark, and the small bravery of doing necessary work while already cold. Those things rarely fossilize. So to understand the human cost, we have to read the house not only as a building, but as a pressure map. Where did the cold enter? Who had to block it? Where did the smoke gather? Who spent the most time under it? Where was food stored? Who guarded it, stretched it, cooked it, and worried over it? Where were the animals? Who cleaned after them? Where did children sleep? Who woke when they cried? Where did the old sit? Who made room? Winter asked practical questions, but the answers were human. A person waking before dawn in a cold house did not wake into romance. They woke into obligation. The room might still be dark enough that the walls felt closer than they were. Ash lay over embers like a grey blanket. The air near the floor held the night's cold. Breath might show faintly before the fire revived. If animals were nearby, their sounds came first: a shift, a snort, a hoof against wood or earth. The human body, still heavy with sleep, had to begin the daily work of making the house alive again. That first person up carried more than a task. They carried the household over the threshold between night and day. If the fire returned easily, the house softened. If it did not, everyone's morning began with a little less grace. This is how emotional life can depend on tinder. A bad fire could sour the hour. Damp fuel could make tempers rise before the room did. Smoke could sting eyes just as work began. The person crouched at the hearth was not merely lighting a fire, they were trying to restart the household's confidence. And confidence was fragile. Winter had a way of making bodies feel older. Knees stiffened, fingers cracked, damp wool rubbed. Smoke irritated eyes and throat. Heavy clothing helped, but it also made movement clumsy. Carrying water or fuel in cold weather could numb the hands, strain the back, soak hems, and turn a short errand into a test of patience. If you slipped, there was no warm bathroom waiting with dry towels and a cheerful little radiator. There was the same smoky room, the same limited cloth, the same need to keep working. The poor body had fewer ways to recover. That is one of the major differences between hardship and poverty. Hardship is an event. Poverty is hardship with fewer exits. A wealthy person could experience winter discomfort and still have backups: servants, better clothing, more bedding, more fuel, preserved foods, separate spaces, social claims on other people's labour. A poor household could be clever, disciplined, affectionate and skilled, and still live close to the edge. One illness, one failed roof patch, one animal lost, one bad store of grain, one dispute over access to fuel, and the edge moved inward. The medieval home could hide that edge from outsiders. From the lane, a cottage with smoke rising from it might seem secure. Inside, the household might be counting loaves, counting sticks, counting days until work changed, counting the needs of animals against the needs of people, counting how much cold a body could take without admitting fear, counting perhaps who was strong enough to go outside again. This counting shaped relationships. A warm household was not necessarily a gentle household, and a harsh household was not necessarily loveless. Scarcity complicates morality. A parent might snap at a child not from cruelty, but because an open door costs heat. A servant might be scolded for wasting fuel because the master is unjust, or because the household really does need that wood later, or both at once. A wife might manage food with a sternness that looks ungenerous, until you understand she is trying to make tomorrow possible. A child might be told to be quiet, not because nobody cares, but because everyone is tired and the baby finally slept. Survival can make people tender. It can also make them sharp. The same closeness that preserved heat could magnify grief. If someone died in winter, the house did not become a poetic symbol. It became a practical problem filled with sorrow. The body had to be managed according to custom, faith, weather, and possibility. Travel to a burial place could be difficult. The household lost not only a person, but labour, knowledge, companionship, and heat in the most literal sense. A sleeping place changed. A task had no owner. A voice no longer answered in the dark. Medieval people were familiar with death in ways modern people often are not. But familiarity is not indifference. Grief does not become smaller because it is common. It only learns the routes it must take through daily work. The winter house also held fear for animals, and this was not sentimental weakness. Livestock were part of the household economy. A cow, sheep, pig, goat, horse, or ox could mean milk, wool, meat, labour, manure, rent payment, breeding, transport, or survival next year. Losing an animal in winter could change the household's future. Protecting animals indoors or nearby was not merely affection, though affection may have existed. It was strategy. It was wealth breathing in the dark. If an animal sickened, the household felt it. Not only emotionally, but structurally. More attention, more worry, perhaps more warmth, perhaps more space, perhaps a decision no one wanted to make. The medieval house held human vulnerability and animal vulnerability together, because the economy did not keep them separate. And then there were the neighbours. Winter could isolate, but it could also reveal dependence. A household might need help with repairs, illness, childbirth, death, fuel, food, animals, or simple information. Villages were not always harmonious, and nobody should imagine a snow-covered community as a painting of universal kindness. People gossiped, argued, competed, owed, resented, helped, remembered insults, and borrowed things. In other words, they were people. But mutual dependence had force. If your roof failed, a neighbour's skill mattered. If your fire died and you needed flame, another hearth mattered. If an animal strayed, others might know. If illness entered, local women, kin, or neighbours might assist. If snow blocked a path, more than one body might be needed. The house protected the household, but the village protected the houses, imperfectly, unevenly, and with all the social complications that come free with human beings. A medieval winter home, then, was never only private. Even behind a closed door, it was connected to fields, woods, rights, neighbours, parish, lordship, markets, weather, animals, labour, and memory. The walls held heat, but they did not cut the household off from the world. They concentrated the world into one room. That is the human cost and the human dignity together. People endured not because they were simpler than we are, or tougher in some vague ancestral way, but because they had to become skilled at living inside limits. They learned the moods of materials. They learned which discomforts could be ignored and which must be answered immediately. They learned to make warmth travel from field to roof, from sheep to blanket, from forest to flame, from body to body in the dark. And when the fire finally took in the morning, when the first real heat lifted from the hearth and touched faces in the room, it did not erase the cost. It only made the cost bearable for another day. What we know about these houses comes to us unevenly, like warmth from a poor fire. Some evidence is solid under the hand. Archaeologists can find the line of a wall, the stain of a hearth, the post hole where timber once stood, the compacted floor where people walked, worked, spilled, swept, and walked again. They can find burnt clay, fragments of daub, roof material in rare conditions, animal bones, storage pits, tools, pottery, and the marks left by ordinary life after ordinary life has vanished. Surviving buildings, especially from later medieval centuries or better funded households, can show timber framing, smoke-blackened rafters, cruck construction, roof forms, hearth positions, and the slow evolution from open halls to more divided rooms. But a house is not only what survives. The difficulty is that comfort leaves poor evidence. Warmth does not fossilize. A draft leaves no signature unless it helped damage the building. The feeling of damp wool against skin disappears. So does the smoky taste of air, the irritation in the eyes, the relief of a dry bed, the private complaint of someone pushed to the colder edge, the exact moment when a family laughed because the roof held and the cow did something undignified. Archaeology can tell us where people lived. It cannot always tell us how the room felt at midnight in February. Written records help, but they also squint. Medieval documents were not produced evenly across society. Elites, monasteries, courts, manors, towns, and legal institutions left more records than the poorest households. Estate accounts may tell us about timber, repairs, fuel, rents, livestock, stores, and building work. Wills and inventories can reveal beds, blankets, hangings, utensils, tools, and the possessions someone had enough status or property to record. Town regulations can show anxieties about fire, building materials, smoke, or crowded structures. But these records often speak most clearly about people who owned enough, owed enough, broke rules dramatically enough, or mattered enough to someone with ink. The ordinary poor appear more like weather, present everywhere, described indirectly, and notice most when something goes wrong. Images can tempt us too. Manuscript illuminations, paintings, carvings, and later reconstructions give us rooms, hearths, beds, walls, roofs, and work scenes. They are useful, but they are not photographs. Some are symbolic, some compress space, some show elite interiors, some use convention rather than observation, some make houses tidier than they were because art has always had a talent for cleaning up after history. A painted hearth may show us an idea of domestic life, but not the full argument between smoke and lungs. Even surviving houses can mislead gently. A medieval building that survives into the present has usually been altered, repaired, modernised, restored, reinterpreted, cleaned, stabilised, and sometimes made presentable for visitors who prefer their history with safe stairs and less livestock. A charming old hall with a neat hearth and polite lighting may once have been darker, smokier, busier, and more crowded. Museums must make choices. Reconstructions must choose one moment in time. A building that lived for centuries was never one frozen thing. It changed as people changed it. This is why careful historians avoid the sentence, "medieval people lived like this," as if 1,000 years and a continent can fit into one room. Some households had open hearths, some had fireplaces, some had chimneys earlier than others, depending on class, region, building type, and date. Some lived close to animals, others separated them. Some slept in halls, some in chambers, some in lofts, some in spaces we might not comfortably call bedrooms at all. Some had glass windows, many did not. Some used shutters, cloth, horn, or other coverings. Some had beds with curtains, others had simpler bedding. Some had stone walls, others timber, turf, clay, or combinations that reflected local materials more than anyone's aesthetic theory. The medieval world was not one cottage. It was 1,000 local solutions arguing with weather. There is also the matter of climate. The phrase medieval winter can make the past sound permanently frozen, as if Europe spent centuries inside a snow globe with poor ventilation. That is not accurate. Winters varied. Some were mild, some bitter, some wet, some dry, some disastrous. The period often called the medieval warm period, or medieval climate anomaly, affected parts of the world unevenly and did not mean nobody faced severe cold. Later medieval centuries saw climatic instability that would eventually move toward the colder conditions associated with the Little Ice Age, but the boundaries are debated and regional patterns matter. A household did not live inside a climate chart. It lived inside this winter, this storm, this fuel pile, this roof. That distinction matters because broad climate labels can hide local reality. A generally warmer period could still contain brutal cold snaps. A colder trend could still include manageable winters. A coastal village facing damp wind had a different problem from an upland settlement buried in snow. A Scandinavian farm, an English village, a Flemish town, and an alpine community all had winter, but winter spoke with different accents. The evidence for animals inside or near the house also requires care. In some regions, byre houses and longhouses clearly joined human and animal spaces under one roof or within connected structures. In other places, animals were housed separately or in arrangements that shifted over time. It would be false to say every medieval family slept beside a cow. It would also be false to deny that, for many households, the boundary between domestic life and animal life was much thinner than ours. The correct image is not universal cow bedroom chaos. It is regional practicality. History is often less dramatic and more interesting that way. The same caution applies to smell. We can reasonably say that smoke, animals, damp textiles, food, earth floors, straw, sweat, and stored goods shaped indoor air. But we should not turn every medieval home into a cartoon swamp of filth. People managed their spaces. They swept, refreshed rushes or straw where used, aired what they could, stored carefully, washed when practical, and followed standards that made sense in their world. They were not modern. They were not stupid. They were not living inside a joke written by someone with central heating. The harder truth is better. They knew discomfort intimately and developed systems around it. That is why uncertainty does not weaken the story. It strengthens it. When the evidence is fragmentary, we have to look more carefully at what can be said. We can say that fuel mattered enormously. We can say that walls, roofs, and hearths were shaped by local materials and class. We can say that open fires created smoke problems. We can say that textiles were crucial to warmth. We can say that animals, food storage, labour rhythms, and household hierarchy shaped winter survival. We can say that ordinary comfort was made through maintenance rather than purchase. What we cannot honestly say is that there was one medieval way to be cosy. There were many ways, some clever, some miserable, some beautiful for 10 minutes near the fire, and unpleasant again as soon as someone opened the door. The evidence gives us a scattered map. The body helps us read it. Cold feet, damp cloth, smoke in the eyes, hunger, fatigue, relief, crowding, and the deep human need to be near warmth are not difficult to understand across time. We must be careful not to invent details, but we do not need to invent the desire to survive winter. That desire is old enough to need no translation. So when we imagine the medieval winter house now, the best image is not a perfect reconstruction, polished and complete. It is a room built from partial evidence and honest caution. A hearth we know mattered, walls made from local materials, a roof holding weather back, stored food somewhere in the dark, bedding guarded from damp, people gathered closer than modern comfort would prefer, and smoke rising into a roof that remembers more than any document chose to write down. The past does not give us the whole room. It gives us enough ash to know there was fire. The echo of those winter houses is quieter than the buildings themselves. Most of us do not live with a hearth as the centre of household survival. We do not count firewood before sleep, or worry that opening a door too long will punish everyone in the room. We do not usually share a roof with cattle, store summer in the form of thatch above our heads, or judge the moral character of a wall by how stubbornly it resists wind. Modern comfort has moved the old struggle into hidden systems: boilers, radiators, insulation, pipes, wires, vents, meters, bills, building codes, supply chains, and power stations far away from the bedroom. But the old logic has not disappeared. It has only been concealed. A medieval household knew that warmth had to come from somewhere. That knowledge was physical. You could see the fuel pile shrinking. You could feel damp bedding becoming a problem. You could smell bad smoke. You could watch snow gather on a roof and understand, without needing a graph, that your house was under pressure. Today, warmth often arrives as if by magic, which is another way of saying that many people no longer see the labour and infrastructure making it possible. A thermostat is a very elegant way to forget the forest. This does not make modern people foolish. It makes us well insulated from consequence. The medieval home kept cause and effect close together. If you wanted heat, someone handled fuel. If you wanted dry clothing, someone placed it, watched it, turned it, and hoped it did not scorch. If you wanted a roof, someone cut, carried, layered, patched, and maintained materials. Comfort had fingerprints all over it. Now comfort often arrives through systems too large to touch. Gas fields, electrical grids, global trade, rented housing, landlords, debt, wages, insulation standards, fuel prices, and government policy all shape whether a person is warm. The medieval peasant worried about rights to wood. The modern tenant worries about heating bills, broken boilers, poor insulation, and whether the landlord will answer before the damp becomes mould. Different world, familiar cold. The body notices continuity before history does. Cold still finds the weak places. A badly sealed window, a thin wall, an underheated room, a damp corner, a floor that seems to drink heat from the feet. We may no longer live in wattle-and-daub cottages, but winter still knows how to read architecture. It reads poverty especially well. It can tell who has good insulation, who has drafty housing, who can afford to keep the heat on, who layers sweaters indoors, who closes off rooms to save money, who sleeps under extra blankets not for charm, but because the house is losing the argument. In that sense, the medieval winter home gives us a vocabulary for seeing our own. It reminds us that comfort is not a mood, it is a system. A warm room is never just a warm room. It is material, labour, energy, law, money, maintenance and priority, arranged well enough that the body can stop defending itself for a while. When those arrangements fail, comfort disappears quickly, and the old questions return with surprising speed. Where is the heat going? What can be blocked? What can be layered? What can be shared? Who is coldest? Who has to fix it? The questions are ancient. The answers keep changing costumes. The medieval house also challenges the way we talk about simplicity. Modern culture sometimes dreams of a simpler life, by which it often means a life with fewer notifications, fewer plastic objects, fewer bills, and perhaps a wooden table with bread on it beside a friendly candle. There is nothing wrong with wanting less noise, but the medieval winter home warns us not to confuse simplicity with ease. A simple system can be brutally demanding because every part of it requires human attention. An open hearth is simple. It is also smoke, fire risk, fuel labour, ash, soot, and constant management. A thatched roof is simple. It is also skill, maintenance, vulnerability, seasonal timing, and the serious inconvenience of discovering a leak when the weather has already developed opinions. A shared room is simple. It is also warmth, noise, loss of privacy, social discipline, and the possibility that every cough becomes communal knowledge. Simplicity, in the past, often meant fewer layers between your body and the problem. That is what makes the medieval home so useful to think with. It strips comfort down to the essentials and makes every hidden dependency visible. Heat is not abstract, it is flame. Light is not abstract, it is candle, hearth, rushlight, and cost. Food is not abstract, it is storage, harvest, preservation, and luck. Shelter is not abstract, it is roof, wall, repair, and the neighbour who may help when repair exceeds one pair of hands. Even coziness becomes less shallow. Today, coziness is often sold as an atmosphere. Blankets, candles, warm drinks, soft lighting, rustic surfaces, a carefully arranged room that suggests refuge without requiring actual hardship. Medieval coziness, when it existed, was not arranged for photographs. It emerged when a dangerous season was held back for one more night. The fire mattered because cold was real. The blanket mattered because bedding was limited. The stew mattered because stored food represented months of work. The crowded room mattered because isolation could be colder. A candle in a warm modern room is decoration. A candle in a medieval winter room was a small claim against darkness. That difference does not mean we should feel guilty for comfort. Gratitude is more useful than guilt, and historically less annoying. The point is not to romanticize suffering or scold the present for inventing radiators, glass windows, chimney drafts, electric light, and hot showers. Those are victories. Quiet, ordinary, magnificent victories. Anyone who has ever woken in a truly cold room understands that civilization is not only cathedrals and kings. Sometimes civilization is a wall that keeps damp out and a way to heat water without turning the room into a smokehouse. The old houses help us notice those victories. They also help us respect the people who lived without them. Medieval households did not survive because they were picturesque. They survived because they were observant, disciplined, adaptive, and bound to one another by need. Their homes were made from the world immediately around them: trees, straw, clay, turf, stone, wool, animal breath, human patience. These were not backward people failing to invent modern comfort quickly enough. They were people solving hard problems with the materials, beliefs, rights, and technologies available to them. Their solutions were imperfect, but imperfection is not stupidity. A smoky hearth is not a failed radiator. It is a successful fire inside a different world. And once that becomes clear, the medieval winter house stops being a fantasy background and becomes something stranger, a mirror with smoke on it. We see people who knew the cost of warmth because they carried it. We see our own comfort differently because we usually do not. We see that the history of the home is not simply the history of nicer rooms. It is the history of moving danger farther away from the body. One wall, one chimney, one pane, one pipe, one law, one wage, one repair at a time. Outside the medieval house, winter waited at the threshold. Outside ours it still waits, though often behind better doors. The final insight begins in the most ordinary place, a wall that does its job. Not a castle wall, not a city wall, not the dramatic stonework of sieges and banners, but the quiet wall of a winter house. Timber and daub, stone and lime, turf and earth. A barrier built not to impress a rival lord, but to persuade the wind to go somewhere else. It does not need to be beautiful. It does not need to be permanent. It does not need to survive into a museum. It needs to hold tonight. There is something almost moving about that modest ambition. A medieval household did not ask the home to create comfort in the modern sense. It asked the home to reduce danger, keep the snow outside, slow the draft, hold the roof, gather the smoke high enough that people could still breathe below, give the fire a place to live, give food a place to wait, give bodies a place to press together until morning. The house did not promise happiness. It promised a chance. And every part of it joined that promise imperfectly. The roof was not merely above. It was a seasonal memory of fields, reeds, straw, heather, skill, and timing. The walls were not merely around. They were local knowledge hardened into form. The hearth was not merely inside. It was the burning centre of work, danger, food, light, and rank. The bed was not merely for sleep. It was a warm enclosure, a piece of household wealth, a social arrangement, and sometimes the only private corner a person could pretend to have. The animals were not merely nearby. They were future labour, food, rent, warmth, risk, and noise, sharing the human struggle under one roof. A house like this was not an object. It was a truce. That is the line the whole winter has been moving toward. Medieval coziness was a treaty with the cold. The terms were renegotiated every day in fuel, smoke, mud, straw, wool, labour, and patience. Break one term, and winter came to collect. Leave the door open too long, let the fire die. Ignore the wet thatch. Waste dry wood. Store food badly. Fail to notice the animal's sickness. Leave bedding damp. Let a small problem become a large one because the room was dark and everyone was tired. Winter was not cruel in a human way. It was worse. It was indifferent and consistent. That consistency shaped intelligence. We sometimes praise the past only when it looks like our future. Clever machines, grand architecture, written science, impressive engineering. Things that allow us to say, with relief, they were more advanced than we thought. But ordinary winter housing asks for a different kind of respect. Not admiration because medieval homes were secretly modern, but admiration because they were not. They solved a hard problem without pretending it could be solved completely. They accepted limits and worked inside them. That can be difficult for us to appreciate. Modern comfort trains us to expect problems to disappear into systems we do not see. Push a button, turn a dial, set the temperature, open the tap, flip the switch, close the double-glazed window. We live inside layers of solved problems, or at least problems moved far away from our skin. When they fail, we experience the failure as an interruption. A medieval household experienced winter itself as the condition. So the old house teaches a humbler form of comfort. Not comfort as abundance, comfort as enough. Enough roof, enough flame, enough food, enough dry cloth, enough room near the hearth. Enough patience between people who cannot escape one another. Enough trust that the wall will hold one more night. Enough memory to know how last winter hurt, and enough preparation to hurt a little less this time. Enough is not glamorous. It is also not small. For many medieval families, enough required knowledge distributed across the household. One person knew fuel, one knew food, one knew cloth, one knew animals, one knew repairs, one knew weather, one knew when to call a neighbour, and one knew which neighbour would come without turning help into gossip before sunrise. The house was not kept by architecture alone. It was kept by people who remembered what the architecture needed. This is where the final image of the medieval winter home becomes warmer and harder at the same time. We can imagine a night near the end of winter. The snow outside has crusted over. The path to the door is dirty from repeated feet. The thatch is holding, though not proudly. Inside the room is dim and smoky. A pot is quiet now. The fire has settled into coals. A dog has taken a place that technically belongs to no one and spiritually belongs to him. Someone coughs. Someone mutters in sleep. An animal shifts in the darker end of the building, and for a moment, everyone who is half awake listens, then decides the sound is normal. Nothing heroic is happening. That is the point. The house is succeeding in the least spectacular way possible. It is not burning down. It is not freezing through. It is not losing the roof. It is not letting the stored food spoil tonight. It is not surrendering the last ember before morning. It is not spacious, clean, sweet-smelling, private or fair, but it is holding. Sometimes survival looks like nothing going wrong for a few hours. There is dignity in that, though not the polished kind. It is the dignity of maintenance, the dignity of patching, tending, carrying, saving, sharing, enduring, and doing the unglamorous thing before the dramatic thing becomes necessary. It is the dignity of people whose names are mostly gone, but whose habits can still be sensed in the structures they left behind. The low doorway, the smoke-blackened roof, the hearth stain, the bare end, the repaired wall, the worn threshold. The threshold may be the most honest place to end this thought, because it held the entire argument between inside and outside. Every medieval winter day crossed it. Feet brought in mud, snow, water, fuel, news, tools, hunger, and weather. The door opened, and the house lost heat. The door closed, and the household tried again to make a small world. The threshold was not merely an entrance. It was the line where survival had to be defended repeatedly, by habit more than hope. And that is what separates the real medieval winter home from the fantasy version. The fantasy version glows because it is charming. The real one glowed because people had worked very hard to make sure the fire was still alive. Once you see that, the image becomes richer. A cottage under snow is no longer a decorative scene, it is a record of effort. The smoke from the roof is not just atmosphere, it is fuel becoming heat, heat becoming survival, survival becoming another morning. The light at the door is not simply cosy, it is evidence that the household has not lost the negotiation yet. And somewhere inside, close to the coals, a person turns in sleep, beneath wool that smells faintly of smoke, while winter leans against the wall and waits for a weakness. And when morning finally came, it did not arrive as a triumph. It came thinly, through cracks, shutters, smoke haze, and the pale edge of winter light finding whatever small opening the house allowed. The fire had survived as embers, the roof had held, the animals were still breathing, the stored food had not been stolen by damp or teeth in the night. No spark had climbed into the thatch, no storm had taken the door, no one had opened their eyes to discover that the house, that tired little treaty with the weather, had failed while they slept. That was victory enough. The medieval winter home asks us to lower our idea of triumph until it becomes almost invisible. A dry corner, a living coal, a blanket still warm from another body, a bowl of something hot, a wall that has not cracked open, a child who slept, an old person who wakes, a cow that rises, a roof that, after all its complaints, remains a roof. It is easy to miss the scale of that achievement because modern comfort has taught us to expect the background to behave. We expect walls to be passive. We expect roofs to be loyal. We expect rooms to hold a steady temperature without requiring moral effort from anyone. We expect smoke to leave, water to arrive, waste to vanish, food to be stored safely, light to appear instantly, and cold to remain a seasonal mood outside a pane of glass. The medieval household expected less and therefore noticed more. They noticed weather in the hinge, weather in the straw, weather in the wool, weather in the mood of animals, weather in the taste of smoke, weather in the floor, in the door, in the shoulder that ached after carrying fuel, in the damp edge of bedding, in the silence after a storm, when someone listened to learn whether the roof still believed in its responsibilities. Their homes did not protect them by creating a perfect indoor world. They protected them by making a flawed indoor world preferable to the one outside. That sounds modest, but it may be one of the deepest truths in the history of shelter. A home does not have to be perfect to be loved. Sometimes it is loved because it stands between the body and a greater force. Sometimes gratitude grows not from comfort, but from the knowledge of what the wall is holding back. A smoky room can still be refuge. A crowded bed can still be mercy. A rough blanket can still be wealth. A patched roof can still be the difference between endurance and fear. And because the medieval winter home was imperfect, it made dependence visible. No one survived winter alone inside a fantasy of total independence. A person depended on the forest, the field, the flock, the harvest, the roof maker, the thatcher, the carpenter, the potter, the spinner, the brewer, the neighbour with fire, the child old enough to fetch, the elder who remembered, the animal that provided, the servant who carried, the woman who managed what records forgot, the man who repaired what weather damaged, the village whose rights and obligations shaped access to warmth. Even the strongest household stood inside a larger web. Winter revealed the web by pulling on it. That may be why these old homes still hold our imagination. We look at them and see simplicity, but beneath that simplicity is connection. Clay from the ground, straw from the field, timber from the wood, wool from sheep, smoke from fuel, heat from labour, food from a season already gone, breath from bodies gathered close. Nothing in the room is isolated. Everything has a source, a cost, a memory, and a consequence. The house was a landscape folded inward. And in the coldest months, that folded landscape became intimate. The field was in the bread. The forest was in the flame. The pasture was in the blanket. The animal was in the warmth. The roof was in the harvest. The law was in the woodpile. The weather was in everyone's bones. A medieval winter home was not an escape from the world. It was the world brought inside and arranged as carefully as possible so people could live through it. This is what the modern fantasy often gets wrong. It sees the candle, the stew, the snow, the wooden beams, the wool, the quiet room, and it thinks the past was cosy because it was simple. But the real house was cosy only when 100 difficult things had gone well enough. The candle had to be made or bought. The stew had to be earned from stored food. The beams had to be cut and raised. The wool had to be grown, shorn, spun, woven, worn, patched and dried. The snow had to remain outside. The quiet had to be protected from hunger, illness, fire, damp, and fear. The charm was the surface of the struggle. Still, it would be unfair to strip the scene of all gentleness. There was real gentleness there. There must have been. A hand held near the flame, a shared cup, a child tucked closer. A story told for the 10th time because it worked. A prayer murmured not grandly, but because the night was long. Someone shifting to make space without being asked. Someone saving the better bit of food. Someone rising in the cold so others could sleep a little longer. These small acts do not erase hardship. They are the reason hardship did not get the last word every night. The medieval winter home was built from materials, but it was kept alive by attention. Attention to fire, attention to weather, attention to food, attention to animals, attention to bodies, attention to the weak places in a wall and the weak places in a household. The people inside may not have spoken of comfort the way we do, but they understood relief. They understood the blessing of heat after cold, of dryness after damp, of company after fear, of morning after a night when the wind had sounded too clever. And now, after following them through the low door, past the smoky hearth, over the cold floor, into the crowded sleeping space, and back to the threshold where winter waited, the modern room around us changes slightly. A radiator becomes strange. A clean chimney becomes a miracle with bricks. A window that closes tightly becomes a quiet form of wealth. A private bed becomes almost extravagant. A blanket becomes more than softness. It becomes the descendant of many older blankets, all doing the same ancient work, keeping the body from surrendering heat to the dark. The old house under snow is still there in the mind. Low, dim, breathing smoke. Not charming in the easy way, not miserable in the simple way. Human, compromised, clever, unequal. Warm in patches, cold at the edges, full of work, full of life. Inside the fire lowers. Someone sleeps, someone listens. Somewhere beyond the wall, winter presses its face against the house and finds, for one more night, no easy way in. And that was medieval coziness, not a blanket thrown over history, but a small defended warmth, guarded in smoke, shared by necessity, and paid for every day until spring.